So welcome to the battle for democracy, voting rights, labor, and electoral power. I'm Alethea Jones. I'll be your moderator for this series in March 2023. For accessibility reasons, I will briefly describe myself. I'm a brown-skinned Black woman wearing glasses and headphones. I have shoulder-length dreadlocks, and I'm wearing a black turtleneck and jacket over an orange dress. And my background is the logo of the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. I've always enjoyed being a guest in the past in this forum. And I've done that multiple times over the years. And it's truly an honor and a delight to serve in this capacity. James and I met, as he mentioned, in the early 1990s when I started in New York City politics. It was during the Dinkins administration, and I later served as the chief policy staff of a member of the New York City Council, a newly elected progressive upstart who won by 43 votes against the party's candidate, and that was Una Clark. It was a heady time, right? We'd just expanded the council from 35 to 51 seats, and there was this incredible boost of people of color in the council for the first time. Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, remember that? They did not win, but they really made a mark and really inspired millions of people of what was possible. It was a time of hope, where we thought we had ushered in a new era of quote unquote minority mayors, not a term we don't necessarily use today, but a term that was used at the time. We elected David Dinkins to the New York City mayoralty, the city's first Black mayor. We had no idea that the politics of backlash and of corporate greed and wealth would mean it would take another 30 years before another Black mayor or any mayor of color would be elected. I did notice at the time, though, that the individuals and groups who had some of the most incisive critiques of our political system and how it operated and how it could be improved to serve working people, they stayed out of electoral politics. Right? They did incredible work in communities and other places, but they didn't get their hands dirty. They just thought, oh, that's a cesspool and we'll leave it alone. I'm delighted to say, though, that we're in a new era today, where those with the most incisive critiques are no longer on the sidelines. They're in the mix and they are changing the political game. Yeah, I had the distinct pleasure of working with Black feminist icon Barbara Smith in Albany, New York, where she's based. Well, I taught at SUNY Albany. And one of the reasons I ended up working with her in a book is because Barbara Smith, this incredible socialist activist, became an elected member of the Albany Common Council. And in that role, just used her skills in building coalitions, in highlighting issues, in framing what was at stake to really change the policy outcomes and the makeup of that city, and ultimately helped Albany to elect its first female mayor in centuries, right? So I'd like to share with everyone that we are really inspired in this particular series this year by this new book. Oops, let's see how I can get it on screen. Power Concedes Nothing. How grassroots organizing, there, I think it's up. Yep, how grassroots organizing wins elections. And it really tells the story in a compelling way through lots of interviews and first-person accounts of how a new era of activists have entered the political fray. I'll make one more comment before introducing our guest today. Many people say that our electoral system is broken, but what if it's not broken? Let's consider that possibility for a minute. What if it is working exactly as it was intended? Designed to give white, property-owning and wealthy males disproportionate say and influence as the quote-unquote wise ones who should guide us. And what if this white, male, heteropatriarchal system for wealth holders at its core resists all the changes that we push upon it to democratize? I believe it was Winston Churchill who said that capitalism is an incredibly inhumane economic system, but it is better than all the other alternatives. The same might be true for our robust yet incredibly fragile white supremacist democratic experiment. And the question is, do we defend this system? Do we seek to destroy it? Or do we try to transform it and save the best of what it has to offer while taking it into new directions? We've called this the battle for democracy, but really this is a conversation about the war for the soul of a nation. And it's fitting that we're kicking off in Women's History Month, and we're joined by two incredibly dynamic women. I'm delighted to welcome Sochi Namaka, New York State Director of the Working Families Party, and Hai-Lin Choi, Political Director of Communication Workers of America, District 1. Full disclosure, I'm a longtime member of WFP, both in New York City and in Albany. So welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, let's get started with just a few questions to have the audience get to know you better. Tell us a little bit about your home institution and your current role. How does your organization contribute to the electoral ecosystem in New York State? And what are your primary responsibilities?
Who do you want to start with?
Oh, we'll start with you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Hai-Lin. Quick description of myself. I'm an Asian woman wearing a red blazer and bright lipstick, I was told to say. Very excited to kick off this series to this really important discussion that we're having today. So as Alethea said, I'm the legislative and political director for CWE District 1. CWE District 1 covers New York, New Jersey, and New England as part of a national organization. We have 150,000 members in our footprint who largely work in telecommunications, public sector, and healthcare. You know, we always pride ourselves as saying that we're one of the more progressive unions. And what that means for us is that we fight really, really hard for our members. We're not afraid to go on strikes. I think some folks might remember we went on strike. We had the biggest strikes in the private sector in the last 10 years twice at Verizon. We just recently in 2021 had a big healthcare strike in Buffalo, New York. So we're very militant, fighting hard for our members, but we also sort of think of ourselves as part of a larger social justice movement. And I think at a core believe that if we want to create larger transformational change in society, we need to be part of a larger social justice movement. I think in general, I would say that we also pride ourselves as being very member driven and member led. All our offices are members. A lot of the programs that we do are led by members, and especially for my department, the political and legislative department, we're a very small staff, probably compared to other unions. And so we really rely on members carrying out our programs, but we also really believe that we can empower members to run the electoral programs and the legislative advocacy that we do. I think in the political ecosystem, as you said, we would I think we're sort of known to be a very politically active union, especially when it comes to field operation around election times. And I think, many folks have said this, we see elections as a means to create the space for us to move our agenda. But at the heart of it is the agenda that we're trying to move that empowers working people, helps our members, and sort of, creates the world of our dreams that we want. Right. And so, I think when we think about how we position ourselves in the electoral ecosystem, and our strategy is, we think about what do we want to achieve? Do we have the political conditions to make that happen? And if we don't, then we have to change the train. So we create the space to move the agenda. But at the heart of it is really the agenda that we want to move. And the goal is not to win elections. Of course, we want to win elections, but that's not the end goal, right? It's a means to really create the conditions so we can focus on what we want to achieve.
Thank you, Halen. Sochi, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Alethea and CUNY Sleuth for having us today. And I'm so excited to be here with my comrade and friend, someone I respect a lot, Halen, who's taught me a lot about New York politics. So I am a Black woman in her 30s with dark brown skin and black hair, and wearing a patterned top in pink with a teal background. And I am the director of the New York Working Families Party since the end of 2019. In that role, I focus a lot on our legislative and electoral strategy, on building our organizing base building to build a grassroots party in which our members and member leaders and organizations are really governing and shaping our politics, and coordinating deeply with electeds that we help elect into government to ensure that they have a clear governing agenda and path to win once they're in office. And so the Working Families Party, I think many of you hopefully are familiar or predate me in your belonging to it. We're a grassroots progressive political party statewide that was founded in 1998, I think with the intent of shifting the balance of power from Republicans to Democrats, and an interest of shifting the balance of power from corporate interests to working people. And I think through a series of elections and also just a change in our political moment, the main battle, I think, in New York is a shift from corporate Democrats to working people's Democrats, as the Republican Party is really atrophied, at least within the state, in its power. And so we try to shift the balance of power in a couple of different ways. First, we are a coalition party. And so member organizations, community groups, and labor and individual members make up our party. And so we seek to galvanize those forces, from nurses to teachers to student activists, young people, Black and brown, immigrant folks, kind of moving together and showing that our politics have no geographic boundaries. Our politics exist across lines of difference, probably because they exist across lines of difference, they are more powerful. So we seek to have year-round organization built on those relationships between those institutions and a shared vision for where people are trying to get in New York. We seek out elections that also shift the balance of power. So folks who are familiar with the IDC, right, the Independent Democratic Conference, the group of Democrats who caucus with the Republicans precisely to keep progressive change from moving forward, right? Some key bills around, rent reform and funding schools and public financing. We look for opportunities to use elections to transform the terrain. And so by taking out, which was in partnership with CWA and many other unions, by taking out key members of the IDC, and then replacing them with real working families champions, from Jessica Ramos, who's now the chair of the Labor Committee, to Rachel May and Zelnor Myrie. We're not just a red to blue transition, but really red to a working families vision of government. So third, we also seek to run ideologically grounded campaigns, right? Campaigns should mean something. And to your point, Alethea, before around when the left suddenly got involved in elections, we want to do it if they mean something, and they're not purely about a ledger of losses versus wins. And so if you think about someone like Tiffany Caban, who ran for DA in Queens, even though that was not a successful race, that electorally, that transformed people's thinking about what role prosecutors have to play in decarceration, right? So how do the elections change people's understanding of what power is, what power owes them, what government owes them? And lastly, we seek to do this all in a values and alignments-based way. I think fundamentally I took this role because I think that working people and Black and brown people and women deserve a party in which, you know, your values are not disconnected from a path to win, right? We hear the Democratic Party extolling universal healthcare while being in bed with big pharma and insurance companies and corporate, you know, what does it actually look like if we have a path to win that does not rely us on ceding our values? And so that's what we seek to do at the party.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that overview, both of you, to situate your organizations and your roles and responsibilities. You could say a little bit more about your leadership roles. As I ask you this other question, on a more personal level, just share with us, how did you first get into electoral politics? Or, you know, when did you find yourself bitten with the electoral bug, if you if you ever were? So please share that aspect of your life and why you're doing it as your life work right now.
Yeah, thank you. I totally forgot to talk about my role. I got so excited talking about the work that CWA does. So I oversee the legislative and political operations at CWA in New York, New Jersey, and New England. And again, sort of from this understanding that we're very member-led, for me, primarily, it means that I work with the many locals that we have to build operations so they can carry out the work, to do the legislative advocacy, to run the elections. We do a lot of member political education that is both skill building, but also really consciousness raising. So our members have a world vision and understand what are we fighting for and what are the roadblocks that are preventing us from getting there. So I'm originally from Germany and I came to this country in 2008. I told Alethea, I actually moved here November 4th, 2008. If folks remember, that was a big day. And it was always remember how I sort of landed here and it felt like the street were pouring out from people who felt liberated. And I was living in Fort Greene in Brooklyn at that time. And it was a big street party. And so very memorable moment for me. But I'm a red diaper baby. My parents were both union activists in Germany, guest workers from South Korea who came to Germany in the 70s. And very often I feel like on the one end, I didn't have much of a choice, but on the other hand, you know, growing up in Germany, which is an incredible country in many ways, but also an incredible racist country. And so when I was a teenager, there were a lot of attacks by neo-Nazis against refugee families that came from Somalia during wars. And I just me, you know, 11 years old watching this on TV, really felt scared for myself and my family, and, you know, sort of found my own path to activism in addition to my parents always sort of being involved, fighting against the military dictatorship in South Korea at that time. And so I went to school in Berlin, studied political science, and started after I graduated working at a labor union. And I've basically worked in unions my whole life because I think in trying to understand, I started sort of getting active by really facing threat of neo-Nazis, but really trying to understand, again, how do I change the conditions and thinking more about oppression, how racism and capitalism and all these things are connected. And it led me really to the belief that I want to be part of the labor movement. My parents are very strongly rooted, both union activists, and this is the place where I feel like I can make the most change and I can make the most impact, really trying to be part of this movement that has historically shifted the terrain, as we said. And so I ended up in 2009 working at CWA, and I've been there ever since. So it's 14 years at CWA. I've done organizing for the first 8 years. And then switched to the political department in 2018. And I say that because Sochi was talking about the IDC. My first encounter with electoral politics in that way was the election in 2018. And as Sochi said, for us, it was, I would say, a pretty huge risk to decide basically to endorse all challengers, except for one. I think we're the only union that endorsed all challengers to members of the IDC. And I think conventional wisdom at that time was they're not going to win, but it felt like the right thing to do. And our members also had a strong understanding. These people, the Jeff Kleins and the Tony Avellas, are the reason why we cannot move anything in Albany. CWA had been doing legislative advocacy for over 30 years. We've never, ever passed a single piece of legislation. And I think it was very clear to our members in trying to analyze why is this that, numerically we are in power, but for some reason we still can't get anything done. Not to mention that also they felt like they were not treated well in terms of, their representatives. And so we made the decision and we proposed to our leadership that we want to join with WFP and other forces who felt like, this is a huge block to all the good things. I think that's what we called it at that time. The reason why we can't get all the good things. And I will never forget that, our leadership, sort of listened to our proposal, heard all the pros and cons, understood that we might lose all of them, and then we have to go to Albany and face all of these people who we, fought really hard to take out. And, sort of looked at me and said, you know what, F it, let's do it. And I think it's a tremendous amount of leadership to say, it's the right thing to do. And as Sochi said, sometimes it's not about, of course we want to win, but sometimes it's about, sending a signal, being clear on where you are. Obviously, luckily, we all won, and it was an incredible fight to be a part of. But I do want to say, I think a lot about how if I had known, again, that was my first encounter with electoral politics, if I had known what I know now, that I would have to go to Albany every week and face these people and know that they, would have no interest in seeing me and speaking with me. And, if the political conditions stay the same, we would continue to not really be able to win anything for our members. I wonder sometimes if I would have made the same proposal. But again, it was, I started in the fall before the legislative session. So the election was the first thing that I really, did. And I think about that a lot and sometimes think that this is the sense of urgency and passion I felt in that moment prevented me from trying to be more risk adverse. I go back to that place a lot when I face difficult decisions, which in New York State politics, you always have to, try to understand the risks that you take and try to connect, with that sense. But again, I think about that a lot. And I feel very fortunate that I started at that time, and I really have a huge appreciation for our members, for my former boss, Bob Master, who now is a CUNY professor, who all did this work for many, many decades, knowing that, schlepping to Albany every year, knowing that we're not going to get anything passed, but we have a choice. We have to keep fighting for our members. And I feel incredibly fortunate that I started at a time where everything changed. And we've been able to make incredible progress for our members. And this is the fight that we want to have, right? Changing the terrain in terms of getting Republicans out, building a united front is one thing, but that doesn't really move us forward in the path of progress, right? If we actually want to make progress, this is the fight that we have to have in like a triple blue state. And it's complicated. It, changes the relationship between us and the party, to be quite frank. But it's the fight that we need to have if we actually want to move forward. And I feel very fortunate that this is now, and I feel fortunate to be working with incredible leaders like Sochi, and just in terms of the change of leadership and the movements that we see, to be a part of that.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Halen. It's an incredible way to get us started. And I very much want us to hold both of these energies throughout this conversation, that upstart risk-taking, like we are going for power and risking it all energy, as well as recognizing that when you do win, then you become almost part of the establishment. And then the political calculus changes, right? And how do we navigate that? Because it's a live issue, and it means different things for both of you. Sochi, how did you get pulled into electoral politics? And what's your role at WFP?
Yes. So that was so thoughtful, Halen. I have so many things I want to get back to that Halen mentioned. So I was born and raised in New York. My parents are Nigerian immigrants who came here in the 70s and 80s, and who have really helped us shape meaning and sense of belonging in this country through service and through faith. They are, Catholics, and we participated a lot in the church, and that was kind of how we built community a little bit outside of our very tight knit Nigerian community here, but always had the kind of inside outside identity that a lot of immigrant children have, of being born here, and your parents want you to understand and everything and to feel clearly American, but it always feels a little bit off in some way. I went off to college. I went to Yale University, a predominantly white elite university in a predominantly Black city at that moment, rated, I think it was number 3 in terms of poverty, poor cities in the country. And similarly had the same kind of inside outside duality of being a Black woman in a majority Black city, but yet being within the gates of this very elite institution, of which I was supposed to feel immense pride and belonging, because we all worked so hard for me to get there. And so I, made meaning, I think, of both myself in this country and myself in the university by starting to organize. In particular, I've really been pulled into labor organizing on campus. The custodial and cafeteria workers came from a very long tradition, since the 30s, of a very fighting union of Unite Here. And through just casual conversations, honestly, the Black woman, dishwashers and cafeteria workers who I asked where I get my hair done or where I can get something better than this to eat, right? That I was brought into community, and I started suddenly coming to union meetings, and they're like, this is my kid and he goes to this school. I got swept into this community that felt built on inclusion, while the community at Yale felt built on exclusion. And I felt pulled in, and really had meaning and purpose in that space. So I started organizing mostly as a student organizer. I spent my summers knocking doors in New Haven. And so I came into electoral politics through labor. In New Haven, it was very clear that Yale was the boss, and it's the biggest game in town, and everything that they do as an entity, as a corporation, affects people's ability to just live and thrive in their city, right? Whether people had safe streets or good schools, or whether the fire department actually came to people's homes versus going straight to the university. About resources, Yale didn't pay taxes at that moment, and so the union was very clear that we could have incredible power in the workplace. I think at that moment, dishwashers were making $17 an hour, which was probably the second highest, rate in the country. But their kids were dealing with gun violence every day, right? Or the schools were deeply underfunded, right? There was a huge disparity between like the land of prosperity that was Yale and the sea of despair around it that was New Haven. And so we're like, unless we get involved in electoral politics and actually run at power with the university around what they care the most about, which is land use, which is controlled by the government, we would always be in balance. And so we started recruiting and running member leaders and workers to run for office in New Haven. And so that was the work that I did, for the first chunk of time as an organizer. Did several waves. We did about 3 waves, every 2 years of races, until we ended up with a majority, right? And then a super majority of workers on the New Haven Board of Aldermen. So for me, electoral politics always had to do with worker power. And it always had to do with shifting balance of power in real ways, and building home, really building political home for people. My work at the party, similarly, I think, is about building political home and trying to figure out with the conditions that we have, how do we really take a run at things? How do we ensure that we use our electoral prowess, how we use the electoral cycle to make real gains for working people beyond the organization that we run, whether they were members of the party or know about the party or not. Um, Electoral politics remain a very live and real way that we can really fight in the belly of the beast and take a run at things. And so that's fundamentally what we try to do. And that's what I try to do in my role here.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And it's reminding me that for so many higher education institutions, and it seems especially true for the Ivy League institutions, they are located adjacent to, if not in the middle of, impoverished neighborhoods.
Mhm.
And they are a part of the reason why those neighborhoods are impoverished.
Absolutely.
Right? They hire from those neighborhoods for the custodial staff, for the groundskeeping staff, for security, and then they underpay all of them and also raid the real estate.
Mhm.
So thank you for putting that on the table and having built something to push back in New Haven, Connecticut. Let's switch now to the question that I think is on everyone's minds and what they really want to get to, which is the midterm elections, right? That just occurred. And there is a way in which New York, this solidly blue state, which we know has some more complexity in terms of where the red locations are within New York State, played an outsized role in this midterm election campaign. So what went right this midterm elections and what went wrong?
I know, do I go first?
Sure, Sochi, yes, please.
Do you want me to go
I'm
ahead,
a-
Halen? Go ahead.
And I would actually love to have a conversation with Sochi about that. Rather than just like going one-on-one. I mean, obviously, as you said, Alicia, I have a lot of mixed feelings about the midterms. On the one hand, nationally, it wasn't the red wave that we all feared. I think we were all bracing ourselves, definitely me personally, but also organizationally. We sort of fell into the polls that had all these horrible numbers about basically, voters know democracy is at peril, but they don't really care enough to do anything about it, which is just mind blowing. I remember the New York Times headline about the poll that came out, and I was just dumbfounded that really. And so there was obviously a huge sigh of relief that, there's like a massive loss of like 30, 40 seats and the House didn't happen. And actually, all the election deniers, were dealt a blow, and voters actually care. And, people actually care more about democracy than all the polls had suggested. That was, pretty ecstatic. But being in New York, having worked really hard on, I think, the most number of elections that we ever worked on, because there were so many seats in the House, down the ballot, I think we had like almost 40 candidates that were our tier one, like priority candidates that we just threw everything at. And so being in New York and just seeing one loss after the other was obviously really, really hard. And difficult for a lot of our members to stomach. And every year, every cycle, we try to grow our base of activists that get involved in election. And I'm especially thinking of all the new members who joined our program working on Long Island, how it was really devastating for them to see how the night went down. And also thinking that, we lost our future speaker, Hakeem Jeffries, the House majority, right here in New York. Was a terrible feeling. But then on the other hand, the supermajority in the state Senate, which is, the majority in the Senate has always been really important to us. Obviously, 2018 was a watershed moment for me, for our organization. And so trying to understand and balance, how did we, I think the conventional wisdom was we're probably not going to lose the majority in the state Senate, but we probably will lose the supermajority. That not having happened, I was sort of trying to understand, what does this all mean? And I think the answers, and I don't have the answer, but just looking at it, is that there were very specific issues that were strong on Long Island, not so strong in other areas of the state, a lot of issue based when it comes to local races. And I think also a lot of sort of failures, to be quite frankly, by the Democratic Party on the federal level, right? I think we all know of, I don't know, it feels dumb to make this joke, 5 times Oscar winner George Santos. I think we all know about, I think we're all a little perplexed about how this happened, right? So I think there's also a lot of, shortcomings on that end, and a somewhat more contentious gubernatorial race than expected. So it's a mixed bag, and it's really, I'm still sort of trying to draw the lessons of what does this mean for us going forward. Obviously our eyes are clear set on winning back the House in 2024. This is like, we have our eyes on the prize. We're working really hard, also in partnership with WFP, in making that happen. But in terms of lessons that we can draw from this, it's sort of, I'm really curious to have this conversation about this because I'm a little unclear. And I think, on the one hand, thinking about Long Island, our members are like not immune. They're members of the community. I think there was a very toxic conversation around crime and public safety where we as a union don't have much authority in speaking to, but it really dominated the conversations during the midterms. Obviously a lot of fear mongering, but I think this is what people cared about, whether it was legitimate or not. And we didn't really have, as a union, don't have an authority to speak about it. And if we would have, it would have not landed with our members. And but then I look at what happened in the Hudson Valley, where a lot of losses too, but also lots of wins. And crime was not at the forefront of the conversation. And I think there were a lot of interesting messaging around protecting democracy that worked there. So I'm trying to, again, what does this all mean? I'm very curious to hear from Sochi and from everyone about how do we unpack these midterms that, again, sort of makes you feel a little elated about the loss that we didn't suffer, but also a little confused about what this forward.
It's a scramble. It was definitely a mess. That is definitely true. I think that there are different levels and different ways to think about it, because it's true when it comes to the state legislative races. I think overall is successful, right? I think that incumbents, kind of left and progressive incumbents, fended off challenges from the right overwhelmingly. Two, new great assembly members, or 3 or so, like challenged some more entrenched Dems and won, Sarah Hanna, Shrestha in Hudson Valley, and Mary Jane Shimsky in kind of Westchester, Lower Hudson Valley, a new person, Juan Ardila, coming in from Queens. So there are some upshots there. And then there were a lot of losses. There are many potential takeaways. One, if we remember last year, the electoral conditions were disastrous, right? Redistricting happened incredibly late. We had split primaries. People did not know what districts they were running in. We had lots of new candidates who were coming into their turf for the first time, running in basically like inflationary, like demobilized moment for our electorate. So before we get to the Democratic Party and its failures, I'm just trying to say, like, the landscape was challenging, right? It was a really challenging, generally for candidates and for voters. Imagine, running an 8-week state Senate race and running 8-week congressional races, basically, which was what was happening. I do think, though, there are a couple of real things. I think Republicans, the Republican Party, which, as I mentioned before, is like pretty much atrophied in New York State. They were having a resurgence. They were fighting for their voters. They were out there. Zeldin was out there. The Republican Party was out there. They were fighting for API votes, right? In Queens and Long Island and Brooklyn, really making direct arguments and showing people they, like, come join us. We want you. They're fighting for suburban votes. They're fighting for, white suburban, Long Island voters who, around this kind of messaging around crime and, really stoking fear, that was an active campaign. I think in contrast, the Democratic campaign was out of step with where voters were, and we're not competing for voters. I think lots of people were not getting messaging of any kind, right? I think everyone started getting really alarmed when in the general base voters, Black Brooklyn voters, longtime voters had not gotten a single piece of mail, a knock or anything from the Democratic Party. Like that is actually, and I will be maybe more pointed than Halen, like that is real like miscarriage of like trust. That's malfeasance, that's malpractice. It's all troll malpractice in real ways, despite having raised record amounts of dollars, right? So we know it's not just money. And so I always do think when I hear organizations or people saying like, the Democratic Party saying like, we're going to spend 45 million. Money is never the issue. There's plenty of money in the Democratic Party. It's about whether there's a strategy and a willingness to fight for your voters and put forward messaging. Voters were talking, or swing voters in particular, were talking about two issues. We're talking about crime and they're talking about rising costs. And the Republican Party captured and led on both of them. I think Democrats ran from their own shadow when it comes about crime. And so there was like a lot of ducking and a lot of, and ceding the ground to let Republicans create a narrative that New York was basically an unlivable place. And around costs, and something that the governor actually has made some headway on, right, has expanded childcare this year, right? That was not the messaging about how Democrats were fighting to address cost, despite that being national messaging, I think was actually quite successful, right? Joe Biden and Schumer were going out talking to people about money back in the pocket. So I think there was a messaging disconnect that was challenging, and underwhelming infrastructure. I think what's clear is that there are opportunities here. I think a lot of New Yorkers, whether they are donors or voters or whatever, don't think about New York every year because they look to Virginia, Wisconsin, or or Pennsylvania or swing states. And so I do think that there is a refocus to New York that unfortunately is defensive right now. We're trying to deal with the mess that we've had, but I think can bode well to those of us who do the long-term work of transforming New York State as such, not just as a battleground district. So hopefully it shifts people's energy. And that we get to work together like in a real big tent way and say, this is crucial, right? New York can take back Congress for the country. New York can return, to Democratic control in Congress in order to win what we need around, medical prices, around student debt. Like we do this in order to deliver what working people need, not just to deliver majorities to those who are already in power. And so we're on the ground now doing GOP accountability, letting voters know about the toxic votes that their Republican leaders are taking, and then working together to build a plan to win in 2024 and beyond. 24 is one huge test for us. Let's win there. But also, does it look like for us to really defeat money in politics in New York and to really serve as a beacon, for progressive values? Like, how do we use that energy to build a long-term plan here?
Thank you for all of those incredible insights. I'd like us to do two things in once, which I think they work together. One is to think about the lessons we learn when we miss the mark. Because I think in politics, often you learn more from wins are great. We want to have wins, but it's a long game. And for the long game, when we miss the mark, we can learn even more from that for the next time we get into the fray. And so consider the lessons from the near misses, the far misses, and then think about this moment that we're in where democracy is in peril, right? The January 6th storming of the Capitol building. We know that Republicans and conservatives and the right wing and the evangelicals, right, have a completely different vision of where this country should go and how they want to use the electoral system as a vehicle for fulfilling on their dreams of reinstating kind of a white supremacy patriarchal system. So if we look at the big picture of what's happening in this country, what do you see as the chief challenges facing us, and where do the opportunities really lie for progressives to go deeper and wider with our base building?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, and thinking about the misses, I think for us it starts in 2016. Obviously, very big catastrophic loss and very transformational. And I think we're still very much grappling with the effect of these. But we did extensive polling after the 2016 elections and learned that 40% of our members voted for Trump. In New York, it was sort of, 35, a little less, but still overall 40%, which is in some ways maybe shocking and surprising, in other ways not. And it also gave us, the polling also gave us a lot of information about, where our members consume their news from and who are messengers they trust, issues they care about. And sort of for us, I think it shaped our strategy of what do we need to do to prevent this from happening again. We really focused a lot, not so much on anti-Trump, anti-MAGA messaging, but much more about anti-worker administration, appointing union busters to the NLRB and to the as labor secretaries, and taking on members' health care, really leading on the issues, and did a lot of messaging and campaigning around that. There were all these terrible corporate tax cuts that really hurt our members. The big corporations that we represent, they all got huge tax cuts. They used most of that money to buy back their own stocks, laid off, tens of thousands of our members. So they were very, very concrete examples to point to how this is administration, and they're coming after unions, they're coming after our livelihoods. But then in 2020, when we polled again, it barely moved the needle. And so in 2020, we had overall 38% of our members voted for Trump again. And I think it really, obviously the 2020 elections were not as terrible as in 16, but I think it showed us, on the one hand, that the movable middle is very much disappearing, because people had been in their corners in 16s and people barely moved from their corners in 16, which sort of, I think if you think of electoral strategy, right, you really want to focus on the ones in the middle and, figure out how do you persuade and move. And for us, it sort of, is there anyone to persuade at this point? And do we instead just really switching to, mobilize and engaging, making sure everybody comes out to vote? And so I do always believe that there is a space for persuasion, and it's really important, but I think it really requires us from a union perspective to think about, again, how do we create the conditions that our messaging actually gets heard? Because if you're so pushed in your corners, it doesn't really matter what you say, even if you have all the right arguments. And I think we all have the right arguments and the statistics to make our case. It just doesn't get through. It's not getting heard. And so I think it requires us to think deeper about how do we deal with the division. And sort of, then it's a long way to get to this question of, if I really want our members to understand the fragility of our democracy, of our institutions right now, that we're sort of in this pre-state, I don't know if folks know The Handmaid's Tale, right? But there's flashbacks to like the before times where creepingly, all of a sudden women, can't have bank accounts anymore. And all of a sudden, you cannot get birth control. But it's sort of normalized. And this is, I think, the state that we're in right now, right? There's book bans in many places in the country. Women are getting criminalized, if they want to exercise their autonomy over their body. But it's happening. There's outrage momentarily, but then it's sort of getting more and more normal. And this is sort of the state that we're in right now. Fascism doesn't happen overnight, right? It's sort of creeping in. And I think for us as unions, we see it as unions just need to be neutralized in this long game, right? And so how do we pay attention to, the goals to dismantle democracy, and as a pathway to that, what we're seeing with, right to work legislation coming after public sector unions, this is all part of this effort to dismantle unions so that when really outrageous, egregious reforms are starting to happen, unions are largely, dismantled and can't mobilize to fight back. But it's really hard to talk about this, that this is the moment that we're in and this is the threat we're facing, when it feels like it's not happening, right? It's sort of like climate change. It's very real. And we're sort of almost past the point of no return. But we live in New York. Our members live in New York, New England, and New Jersey. And, we don't have book bans here, and we don't have really outrageous, threats coming that people really feel like they're threatened in the way they live their life. We have more and more floods. And every time that happens, there's a moment of, ooh, but the threat is never really potent until it's actually too late, right? And so thinking about how we learned from the Trump years, and I think really the big realization for us is we have to figure out how we get more members into the space of sort of being movable and really targeting what we think of as like soft Trumpers from like a right-wing populist narrative, because we have a lot of Obama, Bernie, Trump. So we know there is a right-wing populist sentiment there. How do we bring people together so that a conversation can happen? And when the conversation happens, how do we figure out to move from this narrative to, a narrative actually understanding who's in power and who needs to be challenged?
Thank you for that, Halen. The Obama, Bernie, Trump voter, I find incredibly intriguing. Like, what can we learn? Yeah, from going deeper there, because for me, that it's a story of disappointment, like hope and disappointment, right? With the system, and a sense that they're getting screwed from both the Democrats and the Republicans, and folks are reaching for something. I am 100% with you on the handmaiden's tale theory of our democracy's slide to its demise. And it just reminds me of the metaphor of the frog in hot water. If you put a frog in hot water, it'll jump out. But if you place them in warm water and just gradually raise the temperature, they'll stay. And ultimately, they will die. And it feels like that's what we're in. Like it's gradually changing, and we're getting flooded with misinformation and disinformation. And how can you rise above that noise? It's all very deliberate. Sochi.
Wow, it's so grim, Alethea. I'm still trying to understand this frog metaphor. That is right and intense. So Halen talked a lot about persuasion, and so I think I could talk a little bit about the role like expansion plays. I think it's a lot about what we think that we need to do. That there are a lot of voters out there who are just inconsistently engaged or regularly turned off by our political system, but who make up, a majority of our workplaces, who make up a majority of our communities, right? As like younger people are making up a majority of our, a growing part of our electorate. What does it actually look like to have people get into the fight and feel that government actually could potentially have their back? I think that the two kind of macro themes that when Halen talks about were obviously like far right extremism are the challenges we're facing. Big money in politics is the challenges that we face. Seen here in New York, we've managed to pass a public financing system that's meant to kick off next year that gets small dollars in. We have not figured out how to get big money out, but at least allows working people for now to be able to pool their resources and get matched by this state fund to give more to candidates of their liking. It really does help working class candidates, first time candidates, candidates who don't have the backing of corporate interest or who did not come through some kind of pipeline. I think some of the lessons that we've continued to learn is that our ideas are actually popular. When you poll voters, right, or people will say overwhelmingly they support taxing the rich. Overwhelmingly, they support universal health care, regardless of documentation status, regardless of where you work. People support free college, right? There are lots of these issues that are incredibly popular up and down the state. The question is how we talk about them and whether we're using the right messengers to communicate. People support public safety over a police-centered response to crime, right? If you talk to voters, if you particularly talk to voters where gun violence and crime are actually of greatest concern, right? That was the difference that we saw in the electorate last year. A lot of people who said crime was number one were not actually living in a place where crime factored very much into their everyday life. So there's a disconnect there. But if you go to where people are actually every day dealing, with crime and with gun violence, people are looking for alternate responses to crime. People say that the response to crime is secure and stable housing, is investment in youth jobs, is well-lit streets and regular transit. That's the first thing people say. And so we know that those ideas are actually popular and sound. We have to both build the political coalition to make them real, right? Because obviously are very real entrenched interest who are opposing those. And we have to message them in a smart way. But I think those issues are actually very real. We need to be talking to people one-on-one, like what CWA is saying. So much of these hashtags and have like political affiliations and kind of people like just putting themselves into camps. The interesting thing about the Obama, Bernie, Trump voter is that like these are all people who respond to passion and vision in many ways, right? They want to be pulled into something and not be like lectured to about policy points and graphs. So we have to think about how are we like making our politics feel urgent and clear, and we're not lying to our people about what change looks like or how long it takes. And we're not telling people that this policy is going to change their life, and it's not. But like we have to put out a messaging that really mobilizes people and has people feel as though we are taking their lives seriously and recognize just how urgent, crisis, whether it's inflation or it's climate change, how urgently people are thinking about problems that are facing them. I think the other thing that's true is that, to think about 2018, like 2018 was a reaction to 2016. And there's a real movement energy there that I think has fizzled a bit in this moment. There was the push effect of Trump, right? That people were just like, how does this happen in my country? And so people who didn't think of themselves as political got political, right? They're pushed in by just like the reaction to extremism and fear. And there are people who are pulled in. If you think about 2018, the year, of AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Jessica Ramos, like people who are like, oh, damn, that person is going to run for office, represent me. Like I relate to that person. I feel excited about it. I feel like I'm part of something bigger. And so that push and pull effect did create a tremendous amount of movement energy. Add to that movement for Black lives, right? And Standing Rock, and just like the sense generally that people were taking over. I think there are lots of reasons we can think about why it feels different in the pandemic moment. People are knocking on doors a lot less. There's people are dealing with sickness and costs. There's a lot of reasons why our people generally are tired right now. And so I think part of our electoral strategy is also figuring out how to re-engage and reinvigorate the movement energy, because fundamentally, I think the movement energy fuels the electoral energy. It gives people a sense of purpose and it creates a mandate coming out of those elections. And so we have to rehumanize and kind of re-engage people and feeling as though what we're asking to do to participate actually is like larger than themselves and actually adds up to something. Elections are just one of the ways we're asking to show up. Without that, I think we will continue to have sleepy elections. But I do think we can change the tide. If you think about, this is the year of Amazon and the CWA strikes and Starbucks, right? There is desire and energy in New York to beep up, right? Like to really like change the system in a real way. And we have to figure out how to catalyze that and to translate that into, longer term and to withstand the backlashes that we see.
So final question before we open it up to our attendees. And I want to build on what you're saying, Sochi, around like hope. And there are these places where you see incredible energy that's forthcoming in both the labor side and the environmental side and women's rights, right? This election was also very much about the pro-choice vote. And so I want to talk about hope. I don't want to do the hope is the new dope, as Reverend Sharpton used to say. I really want to talk about hope as revolutionary hope, strategic hope. Can you share with us, where do you see sites of something really promising that has depth, that has the potential for scale? And in particular, what's the unique role that labor unions can play as membership organizations? And certainly WFP's membership is expanding. Like, so what's the unique role that we play? Because there are not many organizations that people go to and turn to and trust, right? The church is certainly one of them, and unions are certainly one of them, which allows us to punch above our weight. Our impact is much larger than our numbers would have you believe. So with that, revolutionary strategic hope, where do you see signs?
Ooh, revolutionary. Wrong place at the unions. No, I, eternally and optimistic. And I'm glad that Suchi mentioned the pandemic. I can't believe I did not, even address that at all. But I feel like in all the, starting sort of from a more negative place, and then I'm gonna get to hope. But I think, in addition to the Trump effect, and in addition to sort of the growing polarization, like really hyper polarization in this country that obviously, our members are very much part of, I think the pandemic, as with so many things, made it so much worse, because not only were our members just physically separated, and the workplace as a place where, as you said, Alicia, unions are the largest membership organization in this country. It's the largest sort of, multiracial organization of working people who are not together because they want to be, but it's sort of, they don't choose, right? It's because they work in the same workplace, which is really an incredible sort of advantage, and that unions have, that there's no place in this country that brings together people like unions, because again, they don't really choose to. And when the unity and the solidarity, which is really like the lifeblood and the core of all unions and sort of our source of power, when you cannot create that, like in the pandemic, we represent a lot of call center workers who, after being in the same workplace for 30 years, all of a sudden all work from home, which I have been a call center worker myself. I absolutely understand that, working in the comfort of your home, doing the exact same job is so much more preferable than being a ginormous call center factory where you sit next to each other and have to, take calls from irate customers. I totally get it, but it's really bad for unity and solidarity, as you can imagine, right? Because in the past, we would just during lunch breaks do workplace meetings and, talk to our members about issues that were important. And now we haven't really figured out how to do that. You can do that on Zoom, but it's just not the same.
It's different.
And same for hospital workers who've just been like in nonstop crisis. And same for telecom workers who, used to have workplaces where they gathered in the morning. None of that is happening. So I think I have underestimated too long the just sheer physical separation, how much it really destroys unity. And then add to that how the pandemic sort of was politicized, right? And all of a sudden, these things like masks and vaccines and mandates added much more fuel to the already sort of division that was happening. And sort of thinking about how to overcome that, and really for us understanding the incredible responsibility that we have as union leaders, if you will, about how if we have an sort of unprecedented, or not incomparable sort of opportunity to message to working people. We know from our polling that we did several times that members trust the communication that the union is putting out. They trust union stewards, union leaders as messengers. We have used this a lot in electoral politics. We have not really used it enough in a sufficient way, and we haven't thought deeply about how to reach members just to add another voice. Because if we don't do it in the places where you would expect it, you leave members to their own devices, separated from their coworkers in the workplace, watching Fox News, being in very segregated communities all across the state. And we would be the only force that could break through to that, but we're not using it. So I think that is an incredible responsibility that we have, all unions, I think, have to use more and think about more and use in a deeper way. Because again, no one else can really, it's not like we, they would switch to MSNBC or, something else and listen to that, right? This is really the weight that the union voice has that we haven't used enough. And I think the hopeful thing that I'm seeing is, obviously in the movement, we have this theory that if we can have people understand the connection between concrete material improvements in their lives and the political efforts that made it happen, they will understand that, Trump talks a big game about workers, the Republicans, every once in a while talk a big game, but actually, they want to destroy unions, they want to come after Social Security and Medicare. But if we can point to, the Biden administration passing, all these pro-labor investments that will create jobs. I mean, I'm sort of obsessed with the universal child tax credit. I'm from Germany. I'm from Europe. So a lot of conditions in this country are very befuddling to me. But having had something like that, a very much European sort of welfare style program that is universal, that actually puts more dollars into people's pockets, that even if you don't follow politics, if you don't really pay attention, but all of a sudden you have more money than before, and it's our job to connect the dots and say, this is a different vision for how we want to live together as a society where we support each other. And this is because this happened. If we don't do that, I think the theory is, if we do that, people will understand, yes, this is what I want. And this is, this is how things should be. It doesn't have to be that we just always scrape by, even though this is the richest country in the history of the world, then we win, right? But somehow we, let it slip. But I think this gives us a little bit of a sort of hope that we saw that we have more support now, or as I mentioned earlier, in the midterms, even though we really felt beaten down by the pandemic, by the division, people not talking to each other, we felt that, because we could point to major investment into healthcare, into our industries that would materialize in jobs and in progress, people were interested to get involved. And I think this is sort of has to continue to be the path, especially. And I think you both mentioned it. We're in this moment where I never thought I would sort of be part of this, where there's unions forming everywhere in all kinds of places that no one ever expected, right? And if you look at the statistic, I think 70% of people in this country are supportive of unions. Approval for unions is really high. The number of union elections has tripled. The number of strikes has tripled, and the numbers people participating in strikes. So it's an incredible moment in that sense that what used to be unorganizable, is no more. A lot of these new industries are joining with CWA. We just won an election in like a tech gaming industry that you'll hear about pretty soon. And, we keep sort of winning in all these new industries. So to sort of bring this all together, I think this is a really incredible moment where there's a lot of hope, where we can bring a lot of new people into the labor movement that I think will help us. And I want unions to feel pushed by, we have to capture this energy to guide it into, let's keep changing the conditions to have more change and better change, and to let our members know that this doesn't fall from the sky. We have to fight for it. And this is how we fight for it. And as I loved how Sochi said, we don't lie to our members about how, change is happening. We don't want to take shortcuts. We have to have a longer understanding, which is why for us, we really want to focus on let's take back the house, because I think we can tell a good story about how these material improvements that members saw, were not an accident, and we have to continue that path. So
I love
definitely
that.
a lot of hope. Unions are very hip right now.
I can answer that quickly. I share a lot of the hope in the kind of spontaneous, well, it's not, obviously this is all from organizing, but I think that spontaneous labor action we've been seeing, which we know as organizers, nothing's quite spontaneous, but I think the fact that you just are not anticipating, you see tech, you see academics, you see, you see baristas, nurses. I mean, two of the biggest strikes we had in New York in the past year, right, were the CWA nurses in Buffalo and the NYSA nurses in the Bronx. Really kind of putting their body on the line and speaking truth to private capital, right, about what people deserve and really flexing and leveraging their power in the workplace. I think that is, it's those kinds of interruptions in the everyday are so important for everyday people to feel and to hear. And I think starts to just creates a kinetic energy, right? More strikes happen because strikes seem possible. And so I think that's really exciting. Amazon in particular stood out to me because, Amazon is like the mega corporation of our lifetime. And the fact that a kind of a scrappy group, a multiracial, right, Black-led group of young organizers came together through like finding out what is shared and what's true about you and your coworkers, despite 20 plus languages spoken, despite people coming from all corners and all different 5 boroughs converging in this factory, and really building solidarity and community, and sticking it to one of the largest corporations. We have to continue to have their back because we know that the laws and the systems make it impossible for these wins to stick. But that to me was just like, okay, like we still got it. We can still figure something out. Funny enough, perhaps in government, I think there have been some interesting, and it speaks to electoral work that's been happening on the ground. Even the city council in New York with a kind of majority of women and women of color coming forward and pushing for childcare at the city level. Like that was exciting hope. I'm like, oh, it does make a difference when it's not, diversity is never enough. It is not enough, but diversity matched with lived experience that people are willing to leverage and connect to policy is transformative. Samra Brook, who was the only upstate Black woman state senator until this year, until joined by Leah Webb, is putting out all this wonderful legislation around Black maternal health care, right? And doula assistance. Like that actually has material power in people's everyday lives as we're facing a Black maternal health crisis. The LaSalle victory, which I don't know if CWA wants props on it or not, but we'll give CWA some props on, right? Our chief judge, who wakes up thinking about who the chief judge is of the Court of Appeals in New York? Like none of us really do. We don't think about all the levers of power and whether we deserve to actually have a say in them. And to have this big, broad coalition of progressives and labor and state senators come together and say, how can we, in the year where we lost Roe, where we see all this amazing union action happening across the country, can we actually rubber stamp a judge who has very questionable, as the most generous reading of it, questionable politics on those two key issues, on the rights of unions and the rights of those to seek reproductive health care? Those, that kind of action, which is not against anyone, but it's for a vision of government that works for all of us, I think was incredibly hopeful to me as we kicked off this year. And I think the government action, right, we cannot say, Biden or Schumer, like we appreciate them greatly. They're not anti-capitalists. However, there are some interesting, student debt relief, real money into people's pockets, the IRA, like there are glimpses of the way in which the pandemic and progressives have pushed this government to the left. The New York Times, right, wrote the whole, the America We Need series during the pandemic, which is basically kind of an elegy to socialism without naming any of that as such. But what does it actually look like for us to invest in that kind of long-term investment in our people, not just from a place of emergency and crisis, but from a place of like what people deserve and how people thrive and how so many people have a boot on their neck in this moment. So I think there are glimpses, and it's our job to force open those, that these are not emergency responses. Like, this is actually a call for deep structural change. I think that we're moving in the right direction.
I think, thank you both for that. It's amazing. And I love the the list of items of like, here where there's actually energy, there's movement energy, people are engaged, there's some wins. I think it's really important. I find that in the electoral politics field, it sometimes feels very difficult to hold the long term while also doing the short term, right? And then we get pulled into each battle, each cycle, and how are we like connecting the connective thread between the immediate wins and the kind of the culture, structure, long-term engagement that we'd want to build is always sort of a tension and a mystery. We have, I want to thank you both for what you've shared. It's just been incredibly insightful and inspiring and has such depth.